Today's big show is on socialization through the life cycle. Remember that socialization is the process of acquiring the knowledge and values and understanding of a particular culture, the language of a culture, all of those things that belong to a culture. And it actually, the whole process of understanding the values and norms and rules, if you will, of a culture does continue throughout your entire life. So the life cycle is the stages of development individuals pass through between birth and death. And we'll begin at childhood. It's a socially constructed concept, and what that means is that the idea of childhood has changed over the years, and it's not the same in every single culture around the world. Today in our culture, we view children as dependent and in need of guidance. Now, the next stage is adolescence. It's a stage of development between childhood and adulthood. Adolescence has changes that mark adolescence that are both physiological and psychological. So it has both to do with physically and mentally. There are growth spurts and changes in your brain, literal changes physically in the brain, but there are psychological issues because it's an undefined status. You are kind of caught in between being a child and an adult. And you have challenges of increased decision making, and there is increased pressure. School certainly has more pressure than it does in 5th grade. High school does than 5th grade. During adolescence, you are neither totally dependent nor fully independent. The next stage is transitional adulthood. That's a period after high school when young adults have not yet assumed the responsibilities usually associated with adulthood. Some go to college, some are still looking for that lifetime or a long-time full-time job, that sort of thing. It's a transitional period. And there's also a period where you would go through rites of passage that are typically associated with a childhood, like courtship, with adulthood, I should say. Now, with childhood to adulthood, that rite of passage, and it would be like courtship and marriage and parenthood. During this transitional time, you're kind of going from the childhood adolescent period to a fully accepted member of adult society. A rite of passage are rituals marking the passage from one status to another. The picture here, we're actually going to see a video during this unit about rites of passage dealing with this. Every culture has rites of passage. Every culture marks the status when you go from one level to the next. There are rites of passage from a childhood to an adolescent, from adolescent to transitional, from transitional to your middle years. There are rites of passage, and we'll get more on that later. Your middle years are typically family and employment are achieved, and you're more confident of your life goals. You know where you're headed, you know what you're doing, where you're going, that sort of thing. That doesn't mean you don't change jobs. That doesn't mean there aren't changes within that life that can make middle years challenging, whether it's divorce or change of careers or whatever. But it's a more subtle time than it is in the previous stages. And the next stage leads us to old age, where there are more changes coming and more socialization as you get used to dealing with these sorts of things. There's retirement and the deaths of your parents and your friends and increased isolation. Now, clearly some of these things could happen before. This isn't a pure timeline that must happen at a certain time, but generally speaking, this is what happens as one gets older, and we're talking now an old age of like the mid-60s onward. And of course, the last stage is death and dying. And the process for many people as they near the end of their life, it does require some socialization, learning to cope with that. And that brings us to the 5 stages of grief that you may or may not have heard of in the past. Denial and anger and bargaining and depression and finally acceptance. Remembering about the 5 stages of grieving, they don't necessarily all happen in the exact same order, but these are steps that people typically go through as they get to the end of their life. In each of these stages, socialization does take place, and there's adjustment to it. It continues all through your life cycle. That's your big show for today.